Diep sat across from the investigating officer, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and resentment. The small interrogation room was dimly lit by pale fluorescent lights, making the atmosphere even more tense. She had never imagined that one day she would be sitting here, suspected of a crime she didn't commit. Smith. Diep, we ask for your cooperation. We have received a complaint from your ex-husband's family, accusing you of stealing their land title deed. Do you have anything to say? The officer sitting across from her spoke, his voice calm yet firm. Diep bit her lip, her hands clenched together to suppress her trembling. She looked up, her eyes red but her gaze resolute. Officer, I didn't do it. Ever since I was kicked out of that house, I have never gone back there. I know nothing about their land deed. The officer stared at her, trying to detect any sign of deceit in her words. Your former mother-in-law stated that you were the one who stole it. She claims she saw you return to the house recently. Diep shook her head, her voice choking. No, I only went back once, and that was when I met with my ex-husband to discuss our divorce and asset division. I never entered the house, never touched anything. After that I left immediately. I have no knowledge of the missing deed. The officer interlaced his fingers and leaned back in his chair, his gaze still sharp and scrutinizing. Do you have any evidence to prove your innocence? Can you prove that you weren't at the house during the time the theft occurred? Diep bit her lip, her heart pounding in her chest. She had nothing. Since being thrown out, she had been wandering from place to place, surviving on odd jobs. Who could possibly vouch for her? Sir, I've been living on the streets. Since the day I was forced out, I haven't returned there. If needed, I can ask the locals to testify for me. They see me there every day. The officer jotted down her statement, then glanced at the clock. For now, we don't have enough evidence to charge you. However, if we don't find the real culprit within 3 days, or if you can't provide a solid alibi, you will be arrested in accordance with the law. I hope you understand the seriousness of this matter. Diep felt as though her heart had plummeted into an abyss. 3 days. She had only 3 days to prove her innocence. If she failed, she would face a 3-year prison sentence. She couldn't believe her life had come to this. After her divorce, she had thought that all the pain was behind her, that she could start over no matter how difficult it was. But now, she was being dragged into another abyss. One that, if she didn't find a way out, would bury her forever. As she stepped out of the police station, the cold wind made her shiver. Clenching her fists tightly, her eyes burned with determination. She had to find the real culprit. She couldn't allow herself to be falsely accused of a crime she didn't commit, but where should she start? What clues could help her turn this case around? One name immediately came to mind: Linda, her ex-husband's new wife. Since Linda appeared, Diep's life had turned upside down. Linda always acted gentle and fragile in front of the ex-husband's family, but Diep knew she was far from innocent. Who was she? Where did she come from? Could she have taken the land deed and framed Diep for the crime? Diep had to investigate. She only had 3 days, if not, her life would be completely ruined. Under the dim light of the oil lamp, a tense atmosphere filled the air. Mr. Min, Diep's ex-husband's father, sat silently on a rickety bamboo chair, his weathered face showing clear signs of worry. His wife, Mrs. Han, paced anxiously in the cramped room. In front of them, Hoang Diep's ex-husband sat quietly, gripping the hem of his shirt tightly. What do we do now? Without the land title deed, we'll lose everything, Mrs. Han finally spoke, her voice choked with emotion. Mr. Min sighed, his gaze drifting toward the dark courtyard outside. I told you, we had to be more careful. Now that it's come to this, the only option is to gather money and buy the deed back. Hoang looked up, frustration evident in his expression. But where will we get the money? Even if I sell all the farmland, it won't be enough. Mrs. Han shook her head vehemently. We can't sell the land. That's the only thing keeping this family alive. Mr. Min tapped his fingers on the wooden table, deep in thought. Then we'll pawn off valuables, borrow from relatives. Without the land deed, we won't even have a place to stay. Silence fell over the room. Outside, the chirping of insects filled the night air. After a long pause, Mrs. Han spoke again, her voice filled with suspicion. Something about this doesn't sit right with me. Why did the land deed disappear, right after Diep left? Hoang chimed in. Exactly. It has to be her. No one else could have done it. Who else could it be? But wait, where is Linda? Mrs. Han's voice turned sharp, her eyes full of doubt. Hoang gritted his teeth and abruptly stood up. Linda probably got hungry and went out to get something to eat, Mum. Mrs. Han crossed her arms and scoffed. We're dealing with an important matter here, and she just left. She's pregnant. Why is she wandering around at this hour? Go and find her now. Monsieur Min remained silent, but his eyes betrayed a hint of disagreement with his wife and son about Diep. Diep isn't that kind of person. I know her well. There's definitely more to this than meets the eye. Let the police investigate and we'll find out who the real culprit is. Hoang immediately retorted. It's definitely Diep, Dad. She's never done anything good for this house. Mrs. Ann tensed up, her voice sharp. Because of her, we've lost everything. Soon we'll be out on the streets. Huang, go find Linda now, she's pregnant, and you're just standing there. Huang got up at once. I'm going now. But instead of looking for his wife, he first went searching for alcohol, because Huang was an alcoholic. James was a foreign businessman visiting the rural village where Diep lived for the first time. Initially, his only intention was to learn about the area for his investment project. However, after hearing Diep's story, he became intrigued and wanted to help her uncover the truth. A wrongly accused woman, a mysterious theft, and a new wife with a questionable past. It was all too compelling for James to ignore. To gather more information, James sought out an elderly man in the village, known for being well informed about everything that happened in the community. When Diep and Linda were mentioned, the man's eyes filled with suspicion. He slowly revealed that Linda was not originally from the area. She had only appeared recently under an entirely different identity. According to what he knew, Linda had changed her name multiple times and had been involved in several fraud cases in the past. This revelation shocked James. He continued to investigate Linda and discovered that she had been married before, but the marriage had ended under unclear circumstances. Even more surprisingly, the child Linda was carrying did not belong to Diep's ex-husband, but to her previous spouse. This explained why she was always secretive about her past and appeared anxious whenever the topic of the baby was brought up. Not stopping there, James followed additional leads and uncovered that the land title deed belonging to Diep's ex-husband's family had been secretly sold by Linda to a real estate broker. The money from the sale had mysteriously disappeared. These findings further confirmed that Linda had orchestrated the entire scheme for her own benefit. James realized that without solid evidence, it would be difficult for Diep to clear her name on her own. He decided to help her gather proof. Leaving the village, James was deep in thought. He understood that without concrete evidence, his words alone would not be enough to help Diep. He needed a way to get close to Linda or track down the missing land title deed. With this in mind, James began devising a plan. To prove Diep's innocence, he couldn't act recklessly. He needed a well-thought-out strategy. Would Linda make a mistake and expose herself? And who was the person who had purchased the deed? These were the questions James needed to answer. After leaving the police station, Diep had nowhere to go. The house she had once called home, the place she had lived for so many years, was now closed off to her, offering not even a shred of sympathy. With barely a few coins in her pocket, she couldn't rely on anyone for help. If she wanted to survive, she had to earn her own money. The bundle of firewood on her shoulder felt heavier than ever. The uneven dirt road made each step more difficult. She went from house to house, her voice dry and weary. Firewood here. Dry firewood burns quickly. Anyone need firewood? But no one needed it. Every household had their own stockpile stacked behind their homes. They simply shook their heads and refused. Some even looked at her warily, whispering among themselves about how she had been accused of stealing the land title deed. Their hushed voices cut into her like sharp knives. Her steps slowed, her legs ached, and her gaze grew heavy. If things continued like this, how would she survive? Just as she was about to rest by the roadside, a black car pulled up quietly nearby. The window rolled down, and James looked at her with a thoughtful expression. He hadn't expected that a woman, who had once lived in a well-off household, was now selling cheap bundles of firewood just to survive. "Are you selling firewood?" James asked in his deep, calm voice. Diep flinched, turning to look at the foreign man sitting in the car. She nodded, her voice small but firm. "Yes, dry firewood, burns easily. One bundle is 20,000. James didn't hesitate. He opened his wallet, took out a 50,000 bill, and handed it to her. "I'll buy one, keep the change." Diep looked at the money in her hand, then up at James. Her expression flickered with confusion, but her resolve remained firm. She quickly searched her pocket for change and pressed it into his hand. "I only sell for 20,000 per bundle. I can't take extra." James was momentarily stunned. He hadn't expected that in such a desperate situation, Diep would still be so resolute. She could have taken the extra money without anyone blaming her, but she refused. "Hey, you don't have to return it," he said. "Think of it as my way of helping you." Diep shook her head, her voice unwavering. "I don't need anyone's pity. I sell firewood, you buy it. I take the correct amount, and that's enough." James stared at the woman in front of him. She had been pushed to the edge, yet she still held onto her dignity. He couldn't help but be moved. Taking back the change, James watched her for a long moment before he finally spoke. "All right. I understand." He closed the car window and drove away, but in his mind a thought was already forming. He had to help this woman. Not just because she was innocent, but because she deserved it. 3 days, only 3 days left. If the real thief wasn't found, Diep would be sentenced to 3 years in prison. She sat on the worn-out steps of an abandoned house by the roadside, her arms wrapped around her head, drowning in despair. She had never felt so powerless. Life had never been easy for her, but at least in the past she had always found a way to stand back up after each fall. But this time, was there still a way out? Everyone who once knew her had turned their backs. They didn't care whether she was guilty or not. They only believed what they had heard, that she was a thief. Rumors spread like wildfire through a dry forest, consuming everything she had ever built. Diep let out a bitter laugh. What could she possibly do in these 3 short days? If she couldn't prove her innocence, she would be thrown in jail, carrying a lifelong stain on her name. Who would believe her then? Who would reach out to help her? Diep. She flinched at the sound of James's voice. He stood before her, his gaze firm yet filled with concern. I can help you. Let me investigate this. Diep stared at him. She knew James was a good man, but he had no reason to help her. She bit her lip and shook her head. This is my problem. I'll handle it myself. James sighed. He knew how strong-willed she was, but even the strongest people sometimes needed a helping hand. You have 3 days. How can you possibly investigate this alone? Diep remained silent. She knew he was right, but her pride wouldn't allow her to accept help so easily. James continued. I don't need you to trust me right now, but think about it. If you don't want to go to prison, you need someone who can help you uncover the truth. Diep lowered her head. She didn't want pity, but she couldn't deny the fear gnawing at her with every passing second. She didn't want to be locked away. She didn't want to accept this cruel fate. A miracle. If there was a miracle that could save her from this nightmare, she would give anything for it.